April 1945 was a time of endings. The war in Asia was drawing to a close, yet for those caught in its shadow there was no clear line between survival and despair. In the scattered camps and makeshift compounds where Japanese comfort girls found themselves after capture, life was filled with fear and exhaustion. They were young, many barely in their 20s, their bodies weakened by years of malnutrition and their minds weighed down by shame and uncertainty. They had been told stories of what awaited them if the Americans caught them. The enemy would humiliate them, starve them, perhaps even end their lives. They carried these warnings with them as if they were certain truths. The camp was gray and cold. Ragged clothing clung to thin frames, and the wind carried the smell of smoke from ruined villages nearby. The women huddled together, clutching themselves against hunger and fear. It was in that bleak moment that something strange broke the silence. An aroma drifted through the compound. It was warm, savory, almost sweet. The women froze, glancing at one another with suspicion. Hunger twisted inside them with an ache sharper than pain. They were used to watery rice gruel, bits of dried fish, or roots boiled into bitter broth. This smell was different. It was rich, heavy, alive with promise. One of the women whispered to her companion that if starvation was their fate here, it would be no worse than home. Her voice was thin, a rasp shaped by months of deprivation. Yet as she spoke, soldiers moved into the camp with pots and crates. Instead of whips or shouts, they carried food. A dented pot released steam as portions were ladled into tin plates. Loaves of soft pale bread appeared, so unlike the hard rations they had known. Black liquid poured into cups, bitter coffee that steamed in the cool air. For a long moment no one moved. They had been told again and again that Americans were cruel and merciless. Many feared a trick, that poison or punishment would follow. But hunger pressed harder than fear. One by one, hands reached out. A young woman lifted a piece of bread to her lips. It was soft, almost sweet, and the butter melted across its surface. Tears filled her eyes. Between sobs, she whispered words that seemed to hang in the air. "This is the best food I have ever had." The first taste of bread and butter was more than food. It was a shock to the heart. Yet the women soon understood the weight of what it meant. The stakes were clearer than they had ever imagined. For years they had lived on scraps. Their daily meals had been thin rice gruel, bits of dried fish when it could be found, and roots or weeds pulled from the ground to trick the stomach into silence. Sugar was a memory. Fat was almost unknown. Many had lived for months on less than 1,000 calories a day. Bodies had thinned. Cheeks had hollowed. Strength had drained away until every step felt like carrying stone. In that state, they had expected captivity to be another form of punishment. They had been told that the Americans were not human. They were raised on warnings that capture meant cruelty. Leaders and officers spread propaganda that the enemy would humiliate them, starve them, and use them without mercy. Many believed it. The fear of it was stronger than the cold. So when the soldiers came with food instead of blows, the shock was as deep as the hunger. The stakes of that moment could not be ignored. If the Americans had chosen vengeance instead of mercy, the women would have wasted away. Starvation was already their companion. It had been their shadow for years. To face more of it under the watch of an enemy would have broken their will. Death would have been only a matter of time. But the food was there, steaming and strange, full of richness they had forgotten. In that simple act of feeding, survival opened before them again. The irony was sharp. To the soldiers in uniform, the food was routine. Spam from tins, bread from field ovens, powdered eggs, coffee brewed strong and bitter. Many of them mocked it, groaned at the thought of another can of meat, cursed the monotony of the rations. They longed for the food of home, for pies and fresh vegetables and meals cooked in kitchens rather than field camps. But to the women behind the wire, the very food the soldiers despised was a banquet. Each slice of bread was more than survival. It was proof that the future might not be only pain. Some of the women wept as they ate. Others laughed bitterly at their own surprise. They had dreamed of food like this in their weakest hours but never expected to taste it again. Yet there it was, filling their mouths, softening their hollow stomachs. For a moment the war outside the fences seemed distant, almost unreal. Inside the camp they were not starving. They were eating better than they had in years. But the stakes went deeper than empty stomachs. To accept the food was to confront the lies that had shaped them. Every bite whispered a question. If the Americans were the monsters they had been told to fear, why did they give bread instead of beatings? Why did they pour coffee instead of poison? The act of eating became an act of doubt, and doubt was dangerous. It meant the stories of the past might not have been true. It meant the lines between friend and enemy were not as sharp as they had believed. This conflict of feeling spread through the camp. Hunger battled with pride. Gratitude wrestled with shame. Some refused the meals at first, clutching their pride tighter than their hunger. But most gave in because the need for food was stronger than words. Every meal forced a choice. To eat was to live, but it was also to admit that mercy could come from hands they were taught to despise. In the end, survival won. One by one, the women accepted their portions. The bread softened their cheeks. The coffee warmed their hands. The meat filled their bellies. Each meal was another day of life. Yet with every bite they also felt the sting of betrayal. Their leaders had left them starving. Their captors fed them. The stakes of this truth cut deeper than hunger ever had. Hunger could be endured. Shame could not be so easily swallowed. As the days passed, the women began to realize that the food was not a single act of kindness. Came again the next day and the day after. Routine replaced suspicion. Hunger no longer meant terror. Instead it meant waiting for the clang of pots and the rising steam. The stakes of their lives had changed. Survival was no longer about finding scraps or gnawing weeds. It was about accepting food from the hands of those they once feared. It was about living long enough to face a new truth, one that none of them could yet put into words. The first days of eating in the camp remained etched in memory. The women who had braced for cruelty instead found themselves handed food they could hardly believe was real. The first bites of bread, the first sip of coffee, the greasy salt of Spam on their tongues, these moments were burned into them more deeply than the crack of gunfire or the roar of planes. Hunger had been their closest companion for too long. Now that hunger was met with abundance, it did not disappear quietly. Turned into something larger. The bread was the first shock. It was white, soft, and light, so unlike the dark, hard loaves they had known at home. Some of them tore into it with shaking hands. Others held it carefully, as though afraid it might vanish if they moved too quickly. A few pressed the bread to their faces, inhaling the scent before daring to eat. Butter spread across the surface and melted in the warmth of their hands. One woman bit down and gasped, unable to hold back tears. It had been years since food had offered comfort instead of punishment. The coffee followed, bitter, black, strong. It burned down their throats and filled their stomachs with warmth that felt almost sinful in its abundance. Many had been drinking substitutes for years, bitter liquids made from roasted barley or acorns, drinks that gave the shape of coffee without any of its life. Now the real thing scalded their tongues and settled in their bellies like fire. Some closed their eyes as they sipped, afraid the moment would end, whispering to themselves as if the soldiers might take it away. Spam was different. The soldiers laughed at it, joked about it, cursed it as the dull curse of their rations. They called it greasy, strange, and squeaky between their teeth. They traded it away when they could. Yet the women clutched it as though it were treasure. They licked their plates clean. Some begged for seconds, their shame drowned by hunger. The soldiers smirked and shook their heads, unable to believe that what they scorned could inspire such desperation. One muttered to his comrade that Spam had found its fans after all. There were peaches too. Canned, syrupy, soft. For many of the women, The taste of fruit had been gone for years. Sugar was a memory from childhood, tied to festivals and family meals long lost. When the first slice of peach slid onto a tongue, the shock was overwhelming. A young girl of 17 burst into tears, whispering that she had forgotten what sweetness felt like. An older woman chewed slowly, holding back sobs as she remembered a mother who used to serve fresh fruit in a farmhouse that no longer stood. The syrup clung to their fingers, and some licked them clean, unwilling to waste a drop. The emotions that came with these meals were tangled and painful. Relief and joy were mixed with humiliation and shame. They laughed at their own astonishment, but the laughter was edged with bitterness. Each bite reminded them not only of what they had been denied, but also of who was giving it to them. The food came from the hands of enemies. To eat it was to accept kindness from men they had been told would destroy them. The soldiers themselves seemed half amused, half indifferent. To them this was routine. They moved pots and crates without fanfare, ladled portions onto plates, and poured coffee as if they were working a line in some factory. They did not realize the depth of what each scoop meant to the women across the wire. For the Americans, this was nothing more than feeding prisoners. For the women, it was the difference between life and death, despair and hope. Suspicion lingered in the first days. Some whispered that the food was a trick, that poison would follow. Others believed it was only temporary, that kindness would turn back into cruelty. But hunger pushed harder than suspicion. Each day the meals returned, steaming and untainted, and with every bite suspicion weakened. Hunger eroded doubt faster than words ever could. The women began to form small rituals around their food. Some saved half their bread under clothing, planning to eat it later, only to give in after an hour. Others closed their eyes with each sip of coffee, whispering thanks in voices too soft for the soldiers to hear. A few tried to stretch the taste of peaches by eating them crumb by crumb, licking the syrup from the tin long after the fruit was gone. At night, when the camp grew quiet, they whispered to one another about the meals. They shared the details of taste, of smell, of feeling. They compared it to the thin rations they had known at home, the scraps of weeds, the watered broth. They confessed that the food filled more than their bellies. It filled some broken part of them that had been empty for too long. One woman admitted she could no longer imagine the enemy as faceless beasts after watching a soldier slip a piece of chocolate to a shivering girl. Another confessed that the bread felt so soft it was like eating cake, and she had almost forgotten cake existed. The irony weighed heavy. They had once believed themselves loyal to a nation that promised strength, a people destined for glory. Yet here they were, reduced to tears over slices of white bread and tins of meat. Their leaders had left them hungry. Their captors filled their plates. The food did not erase the war or the suffering, but it changed something within them. It cracked the certainty of what they had been told and left them standing in a space they did not know how to name. The first meals were not only nourishment. They were revelations. Each spoonful, each bite, each sip forced them to see the world differently. They were still prisoners, still defeated, still uncertain of what future awaited them. Yet for the first time in years, their bellies were full. For the first time in years, warmth spread through their bodies. For the first time in years, they tasted something like mercy. And that taste was as sharp and unforgettable as the hunger it replaced. The meals soon turned from shock into routine. What began as disbelief became a daily rhythm. Morning came with the sound of pots dragged across rough tables and the low voices of guards moving through the compound. For the women behind the wire, those sounds became a clock more certain than the sun. Each clang of metal meant food was coming. They gathered with their cups and battered plates, their eyes fixed on the steam that curled into the gray air. Hunger no longer carried only fear, carried a strange anticipation. The first sip of coffee each morning felt like a return to life. It was bitter, strong, and it burned down into empty stomachs with a heat that seemed impossible. Many closed their eyes as they drank, whispering to themselves, afraid that to show how much it meant might invite punishment. The bread was soft enough to tear without effort. Some pressed their faces to it as though its scent alone was sacred. Butter melted on its surface and filled bellies that had long been empty. A woman sometimes tried to save half her slice, hiding it in clothing, but hunger always defeated resolve. The bread was eaten within the hour, and the shame of giving in was followed by relief. The soldiers moved with little thought for symbolism. To them Spam was a curse. They mocked its taste and its greasiness. They traded it when they could. Yet across the wire women held it as treasure. They licked their plates clean. They ate with such hunger that the soldiers could not help but laugh. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One soldier muttered that Spam had finally found its admirers. To him it was only a joke, but to the women it was salvation. Numbers revealed the contrast in cruel clarity. German civilians had often survived on 1,000 calories a day in the final year of war. Japanese women had known similar shortages, their diets stripped down to scraps and roots. The American ration, by contrast, was designed for 3 times that amount. Bread, meat, coffee, peaches, chocolate, powdered eggs, all supported by a machine that fed millions of men. To the women behind the wire, these numbers became flesh. Their faces filled out. Hollows beneath their eyes softened. Even laughter began to return, hesitant at first, but real. Still suspicion lingered. Whispers spread that the food was a trick, that one day it would stop, that kindness was only bait for cruelty. Others spoke of poison, of hidden motives. Yet each day the food came, steady and unchanging. Each day the coffee steamed and the bread was warm. Fear dissolved beneath the rhythm of nourishment. The truth of their own bodies, filling again with life, was harder to deny than the words of any speech they had once believed. In the evenings they spoke of what the food meant. One remembered bread so soft it felt sweeter than the cakes of her childhood. Another confessed that kindness shamed her more than hatred. They had been told that Americans would be merciless. Yet here were young men pouring coffee with shy smiles, muttering about home and family. The food was undoing something deeper than hunger. It was undoing belief itself. There was irony in every meal. Soldiers complained about rations and laughed when prisoners treated them as gifts. One tried to trade away Spam for cigarettes, only to watch a woman clutch it to her chest like treasure. Another teased that their captives were becoming fans of American cooking. The women did not answer. They were too busy eating, though a faint smile sometimes betrayed their thoughts. Personal memories surfaced with each bite. A girl of 17 remembered canned peaches as the first true sweetness she had tasted in years, and she wept until her hands shook. An older woman recalled stealing food in her village during shortages. Ashamed but desperate. Now she was given more than she could finish. The food stirred grief as much as gratitude. It reminded them of homes destroyed, of families lost, of lives that would never return. Food became more than sustenance. It became a language that carried meanings too heavy for words. Every slice of bread was both mercy and accusation. Every cup of coffee was both comfort and shame. The women could not deny what they tasted. They could not deny that the enemy had fed them better than their own people had in the final years. To eat was to live. To eat was also to question. And with each passing day the questions grew sharper, heavier, more impossible to silence. The food did more than fill empty stomachs. It began to change how the women saw themselves and the world around them. Hunger had been a weight they carried for years. Now that weight lifted, and in its place came questions they had never dared to ask. If the enemy could feed them, what else had been a lie? If mercy could come from hands they were told would be cruel, what did that say about the people who had starved them? Each meal was not only nourishment but a quiet test of belief. The women began to see the soldiers differently. At first they avoided eye contact, afraid of insult or punishment. Slowly that fear softened. They saw young men, many no older than themselves, joking with one another, scribbling letters home, laughing at the same rations that their captives treated as treasure. A soldier slipped a piece of chocolate to a shivering girl, embarrassed when she wept as she tasted it. Another poured extra coffee with a sheepish smile. These small gestures were not grand, yet they carried more power than speeches. They broke apart the image of faceless monsters and replaced it with something harder to hate. At night, the women whispered their feelings. Some admitted gratitude, though it shamed them to say it aloud. Others confessed that the food reminded them of childhood, of mothers baking bread or serving rice balls on festival days. These memories came with tears. They were forced to remember not only what they had lost, but also what had been hidden from them. For years they had been told the enemy was without mercy. Yet each bite proved otherwise. Still there was conflict within them. Gratitude pulled one way, pride pulled the other. Some fought against the food, holding on to defiance as if it were the last piece of loyalty they could keep. They sat stiff and refused to eat, though their eyes followed every plate. Most gave in when hunger tore at them. The shame of accepting bread from an enemy was sharp, but the relief of survival was stronger. The women felt that shame deepen with every bite, and yet they kept eating. The food also became a marker of change in their bodies. Cheeks filled out, skin softened, and voices grew stronger. Laughter, faint at first, returned in stolen moments. Soldiers noticed and wrote about it in letters home. They told of women who clutched bread like treasure, of faces brightening after chocolate, of captives who smiled faintly when offered seconds of coffee. For the soldiers, it was a reminder of how much the war had destroyed. What they considered ordinary became a miracle in the eyes of those they had captured. For the women, the change went deeper. The food forced them to reckon with betrayal. Their leaders had promised strength and glory, yet they had been left hungry and broken. Their captors, who were supposed to be merciless, gave them nourishment. Each meal asked a question that grew harder to ignore. Who had been the true betrayer? The enemy who fed them or the leaders who starved them? The questions did not always lead to comfort. Some women wept as they ate, unable to bear the kindness. Others laughed bitterly, mocking their own astonishment. Many were silent, lost in thought as they chewed each bite slowly. The food filled their bellies, but it also unsettled their minds. It cracked open certainties and left space that shame and confusion rushed to fill. The transformation was quiet but steady. Every morning they lined up with less fear. Every day suspicion weakened. Every night their whispers carried more doubt about what they had once believed. They saw the soldiers as young men, tired and human. They saw themselves as more than victims because survival itself felt like defiance. And through it all, the food became the bridge between what they had been taught and what they could now see. By the time weeks had passed, the women understood that the meals were more than rations. They were revelations. Bread meant mercy. Coffee meant warmth. Chocolate meant joy long forgotten. Spam, mocked by soldiers, meant survival. These meanings sank deeper than hunger, deeper than pride. They carried the weight of a truth that none of them could escape. The world was not what they had been told. Mercy was possible, even from those they had been ordered to fear. And that truth was both their greatest comfort and their sharpest wound. The food did not remain just food. It became something larger, something that forced the women to see the world with new eyes. At first it was only shock. Bread was soft, coffee was bitter, and chocolate was sweet beyond memory. But after days passed and the meals continued, the shock turned into reflection. Each bite asked questions that none of them had answers for. If the enemy could feed them, what else had been a lie? If kindness could come from hands they were told to fear, what did that say about the leaders who had left them starving? The soldiers were not what the women had expected. They were young, sometimes clumsy, sometimes joking. They complained about spam, about the taste of rations, about the dull routine of meals. To the women, these same rations were treasures. The soldiers did not seem to notice the meaning of what they gave. They ladled out portions without thought, poured coffee with tired hands, and laughed among themselves as if it was all nothing. Yet the women could not look at it that way. Every slice of bread, every sip of coffee, carried a weight that was heavier than words. At night they whispered their feelings. One spoke of her mother baking bread, and how the taste returned a memory she thought had been lost. Another said chocolate was so sweet that it hurt, reminding her of childhood festivals before the war. These whispers were filled with both joy and grief. They were reminded of what had been stolen from them, but also of what was still possible. Shame mixed with gratitude. Many felt humiliated that the enemy fed them better than their own leaders. Some refused meals at first, trying to hold on to pride. They sat stiff and silent while others ate. But hunger wore them down. Pride could not fill an empty stomach. Slowly, even those who resisted reached for bread, drank coffee, and ate the food that saved them. Their pride broke, and they wept as they chewed. The change in their bodies was plain. Hollow cheeks softened. Eyes brightened. Laughter returned in small bursts. Soldiers noticed and wrote of it. They wrote home about women clutching bread like treasure, about tears falling over slices of peach, about captives who smiled faintly when offered more coffee. For the men in uniform it was almost amusing. For the women it was life. Yet with survival came questions that cut deeper than hunger. Why had their own leaders left them starving while the enemy gave them food? Why had they been told stories of cruelty that now proved false? Each meal forced them to wonder who had betrayed them more, the enemy across the wire or the people they once served. The food was not only nourishment. It was proof. Proof that mercy was possible, proof that belief could be broken by a loaf of bread and a cup of coffee. The women felt conflicted with every bite. Gratitude pulled at them, but pride and shame pushed back. Still they ate because survival demanded it. And in that act of survival, their view of the world shifted. The soldiers were no longer faceless threats. They were young men who poured coffee, who sometimes shared chocolate, who spoke of home. The women could no longer see them only as monsters. They saw them as human, and that truth was heavier than any ration. By the time weeks had passed, the food had done more than keep them alive. It had transformed them. It had forced them to see that the world was not simple. It had forced them to admit that mercy could come from the enemy, while betrayal had come from those they once trusted. That truth was both comfort and wound. Every meal was a reminder that the war had stolen not only years of hunger, but also the certainty of belief.